Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific, brought to you by our producer, IEJ Media, and our sponsor, Bauer Group Asia. We will tell you more about them in due course. I'm Ray Powell, the former military officer. I am here in California. Over there is Jim Caruso. He is still in New York, getting ready for his annual snowbird trip down to Arizona. How are you, Jim?
Given the fact it was in the 40s last night, it's looking like Arizona's coming up real soon, thank goodness.
It's that time of year.
It is. So speaking of snowbirds, someone who goes south to Australia every so often is Australia's former ambassador to Washington, Arthur Sinodinos. Welcome, Arthur. Arthur has a distinguished career as a public servant in Australia, served as Chief of Staff to Prime Minister John Howard for years, was a minister in the Turnbull and Abbott governments, doing industry and science. And it's great to have you on, Arthur. You were ambassador during a critical time in actually American history. But the first thing we want to talk to you about is you were instrumental in the negotiations that led to AUKUS. And why should we care about how those negotiations went? What can we learn from that?
Thanks, Jim. And the first thing to say is that you and I share another bond. We originally got links with Kefalonia in the Ionian Sea between Greece and Italy. So Karousiotis, I think, is your full name. You have more of the Kefalonian sort of addition at the end, the suffix. So you're a Rigi-Dig one. Sinodinos sort of is a blow-in, I think. But look, a pleasure to be with you today. And look, on AUKUS, when I first went to the US in 2000, I wasn't going to a sinecure, but I thought, well, this is a step down from politics. It's not going to have the same intensity and pace as politics. But what happened very quickly is I realized in the last year of Trump, with the election coming up and COVID hitting us, that we suddenly in the middle of a lot of things that we had to manage at the embassy. But then with the transition to a new administration, it became clear very quickly that the new administration were very interested in how to further develop a relationship with allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. And this was symbolized.
Sorry, just to clarify, this is in 2020, 2021, the new administration at the time being the Biden administration. Yeah, with the new administration, the Biden administration, what was particularly significant is they appointed Kurt Campbell as Indo-Pacific coordinator at the White House. That was a real indication of the priority they placed on Indo-Pacific policy. And then as that policy started to develop, it collided with some developments in Australia. And what was happening in Australia is we were reaching a stage with the deal with the French Naval Group about the diesel-powered submarines that we were going to buy from them. We were reaching a critical stage or gateway, and we had to evaluate whether to proceed or consider another option. And the reason we started to consider another option, and in this case a nuclear-powered option, was because the strategic circumstances in the region were clearly deteriorating more quickly than we had expected even a few years ago. We'd had a strategic defence update in 2020, which indicated strategic circumstances were changing quickly, but it was now clear that this was accelerating and that we had to consider our capability even more critically than before. And it was at this stage that the Morrison government commissioned the work around the possibility of adopting nuclear-powered submarines. And in the beginning, when I was first told about this, I was a bit bowled over because I remember in the past there'd been the offhand spitballing about maybe we should go for nuclear-powered submarines. But this now became serious. And I remember being briefed by Greg Moriarty, the Secretary of the Department of Defence in Australia early on, that Australia wanted to go down this route and that we were speaking to the Brits about this because the idea was we might piggyback off their next submarine, nuclear-powered submarine design, which was called something like the SSM or whatever. And it became very clear, though, very quickly in the discussion with the Brits that the Americans had to be brought in because they in effect, own the crown jewels, which was the nuclear power component of this. And so it became clear very quickly that Australia had to pivot to discuss this with the US. Initially, the discussions were with naval reactors, And they were pretty skeptical about Australia's capacity to manage this process, because we hadn't managed anything like this before. And they had in mind the very high standards that the legendary Admiral Rickover had established for the nuclear navy. Essentially, very high performance standards that would make it almost impossible that there would be an accident, because his view was if there were an accident, that would be the end of the program, any accident. And so against this rather skeptical background, discussions occurred between Australian Navy people and their counterparts in the US, the nuclear navy or whatever. But then we took a view that we had to elevate this to the White House as well, clearly, and make them aware of the nature of these discussions, as you do. And once the White House came into the picture, it changed the calculation completely for the Americans. It was no longer just an issue of if you can do it. It became, well, strategically, we think this is a good thing to do. Let's find a way to get this done. And for President Biden, there were three conditions. Will it be affordable? Will there be bipartisanship support? And will Australia maintain its very high and credibility and performance when it comes to its nuclear non-proliferation obligations? They were the three criteria for the president. He took a bit of time to work his way through all of that. The Australian system, various toing and froing with Washington about those conditions. But in the end, all of those conditions were met, and the president was prepared to sign off on this historic agreement. Now, initially, the Americans were keen to make sure that when we talked about having an optimal pathway to achieving nuclear-powered submarines, it would be clear that the final design would be a matter that would be determined in due course. But by the time we got to the final AUKUS agreement by 2023, we were back to saying we would piggyback off the British design and create what was then to be called the SSN AUKUS, which would be a British boat that could also be built in Australia. Now, the important point in all of this was that Australia wanted to be in a position where we could construct boats in Australia as an addition to the capacity available to the US and the UK in the region. In other words, this was not about cannibalizing their supply lines for our purposes. We would create additive capacity. Now, in the meantime, until the new subs were ready to be constructed in Australia and roll off the British shipyards, we entered into an agreement with the US that they would be prepared to sell Virginia-class submarines to us beginning from the early 2030s. 3, possibly 5. This was to bridge the gap until the new construction came on stream. But importantly, there was a second pillar of the AUKUS, and this was one that Morrison particularly was very focused on, this pillar 2 around advanced capabilities, because his view was that another way to fill the gap is for the 3 countries to actually work together on advanced capabilities in AI, machine learning, quantum, cyber, electronic warfare, hypersonics, you go through the list. So in his mind, that could be a really important legacy of doing AUKUS. But in some ways, the most important legacy of AUKUS already is the way in which we've approached issues of export controls, international trafficking in arms regulations, and what we've done is to streamline those processes. So it's much easier, and I'm getting feedback today from Australian companies about this, much easier for platforms to be shared, information to be shared, potentially personnel to be shared. Still a way to go, but we've done a lot of reform, and thanks to the Congress in particular for the role they played in that. So there are a number of legacies already of AUKUS. There's still work to be done around the pillar 1, the submarine pillar. We recognise that. A lot of debate about that in Australia, and you alluded to some of that before we came on air. But look, I'll stop there for now, and happy for you to follow up.
Yeah, a lot of different ways to go on this. So let me ask then first about that particular question, which is the headwinds in Australia. And headwinds may be an especially poor analogy when you're talking about a submarine. But the in Australia, you've had, most notably perhaps, former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull come out very much against AUKUS. He basically doesn't buy that the U.S. is going to be able to meet its obligations, and that in the end that there's an out in the agreement that basically says if the U.S. can't produce enough submarines, then we just keep them. And that's his major concern. Do you share his concern?
Look, Malcolm is right to say that the agreement is framed in terms of the president at the time, in the early 2030s, being satisfied that America can sell Virginia-class submarines to Australia in the manner that's envisaged in the AUKUS agreement. That's all correct. What the US is doing to meet that commitment is upgrading and upscaling its capital contribution to the submarine industrial base here in the US. We are putting more money into the industrial base. In all, it'll be about $3 billion US in due course. We've already put in, I think, around $1 billion, putting similar amounts into the UK. So everyone in the US, UK, Australia is conscious that we have to do more to make sure those timetables can be met. And in the US, we've seen with the establishment of a shipbuilding council in the White House, the other money that's now going into budget bills around this, this administration here in the US, the Trump administration, is very conscious of the fact that more resources have to go in and more has to be done. And if you talk to people like Joe Courtney, member from Connecticut, who's also one of the co-chairs of the Friends of Australia caucus in the Congress.
And one of our previous guests on this podcast.
And a great all-round person. He will tell you about chapter and verse about the efforts that are being done to do this. Look, of course, you can never entirely predict the future, but the deterrent effect of AUKUS stands on the fact that we are able to convey a sense of ongoing progress. And we show that by being determined to continue to build out, particularly on Pillar 1, continue to let contracts, continue to build infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And while it's good to have the debate in Australia about AUKUS, because frankly, in the run-up to the announcements, there wasn't much debate by the sheer nature of the announcements, it's important to recognise that this is one of the most highly advanced pieces of manufacturing anywhere in the world that will happen. It'll be a great boon to our industrial base if we harness it because of the spillover benefits to the rest of our industrial system. But it is a moonshot in the Australian context. It does mean industrial mobilisation. And now there are moves within the government to give the submarine agency more of that industrial enterprise focus because they recognise more needs to be done.
So there is an announcement by the Department of Defense that Elbridge Colby, the Deputy Secretary for Policy, is going to conduct a review of the AUKUS agreement with focus especially on the provision of submarines. And a lot of critics are saying, you see, this is the Americans already backing away. So what do you think the purpose of this review is, and are you concerned about the outcome?
Well, I think it was inevitable there would be a review. It's a new administration. They would be reviewing the agreements entered into by the previous administration. And also, don't forget the context. This was an administration which came in, expressed concern about the rate at which the US was building ships and building submarines. And so I think they're doing their duty to actually work out, well, okay, how do we stand with this? What are the implications of this agreement? In that context, the other dimension is that they're also working out, well, okay, how's this going to work strategically? How do having more Australian submarines work in terms of our operational plans in the region? So there's a process going on to review all of that. I think that's good. We can't have the review go on for too long because that can create uncertainty in itself. I understand it will be finished come the fall, and that's great. So I'm looking forward to the recommendations. I believe that it will be supportive of AUKUS. Part of the reason I'm optimistic is because the UK has announced more funding for its elements of AUKUS. And they've clearly, through Prime Minister Starmer, made it clear to the president how strongly they support going down this route. Now, of course, there are debates going on in the administration about the extent to which European countries should focus on Europe as opposed to the Indo-Pacific, and that can have implications for where the UK puts its focus. But the UK itself has made it clear that in terms of its Indo-Pacific policy, AUKUS is very central to that. And also they have an eye to the economic side of this as well. And that was certainly the case when Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister. He saw the benefits, particularly for the north of England. But it's very clear that the Starmer government understand both the strategic aspect of this and also the economic benefits for a country like the UK.
So let's go back. You talked about the announcement. The announcement came as kind of an earthquake, right? It hit a lot of people as a surprise, including many of Australia's other partners in the Pacific. Obviously, a lot of consternation about the fact that Australia, U.S., Britain had come off of seemingly from nowhere and started this major new initiative, which was going to derail one program that involved France. Obviously, they were not happy. And then, of course, there were lots of concerns, especially in ASEAN and other places, about what effect all of this was going to have on them and why weren't they told ahead of time. So why weren't they told ahead of time, and how did that affect your job in Washington, D.C.?
Look, a number of countries in the region were briefed ahead of time by various players, including the Foreign Minister, Maurice Payne. But that didn't stop people from necessarily being critical in public if they wanted to be critical. Some were, some weren't. Obviously, the Chinese were not very happy about any of this, which in a funny way confirmed the sort of thesis underpinning this whole thing, which was really the deterrent effect of being able to put this heightened capability into the region. People underestimate the extent to which there's value for the US by actually placing assets like these in the region, as opposed to having to fly in and bring stuff in what could be extenuating circumstances. So I think from a Chinese perspective, they were particularly concerned about this and made an effort to lobby other countries, the International Atomic Energy Agency and others, against what we were doing. And of course, as you alluded to in your question, the fact that we had to do this with a sort of under some cloak of secrecy probably didn't help the whole process. But if we'd been more open about it in the lead up to it, that in itself would have created its own roadblocks and barriers. It's a funny sort of illustration of the point that sometimes the biggest decisions are taken with less apparent process than less significant decisions. But it was in the nature of what we had to do at the time. And you're right, the French obviously were very offended by this, and that created some heat for me here in Washington. I caught up with the French ambassador a couple of times and talked this through. At one stage, we even had a lunch, the two of us, with the EU ambassador, who was a friend of both of us, who was sort of keen to sort of make sure that, whatever the issues were could be ventilated in a fairly civilized way, and the ambassador, the French ambassador, could make his points and tell his capital that he had made his point to the Australians in Washington, as well as obviously in Canberra and elsewhere. It was the Americans who took the most heat on the French issue, and the president was unhappy about that. He was unhappy. He'd left it with us to assure the French. And look, we told the French when we thought it was best to tell them, but you could never guarantee that they would have a sort of equitable reaction to this. Of course, they wouldn't greet this decision with equanimity, both in strategic terms or in economic and financial terms. But the president, I think, was just hoping that it would all be okay. And when it wasn't, and the French cut up rough, he was unhappy about that, and he dispatched Tony Blinken, who's a francophone, to sort of deal with that particular aspect of it. So that was a bit awkward for the president and a bit awkward for us in return. And you've seen the way that President Macron subsequently has behaved on this matter. look, it's understandable. It was a very public rebuff, if you like, but it was taken in Australia's strategic interest. And it was a reminder to everybody that these major decisions, we don't take them because other people say we should. I mean, AUKUS was an Australian decision, an Australian policy development. No one asked us, no one rang us and said, you got to do this. This was something we decided to do in the light of our own circumstances and where we were in the discussions with the French.
So the other concern now is that there are reports of U.S. pressure on Australia to do things like pledge the use of any future submarines in the defense of Taiwan, to increase defense spending up to 3.5% of GDP. And the implication is, and if you don't, maybe the AUKUS deal is at risk. How do you view this?
Look, start with defence spending. There's no doubt that defence spending is under pressure. AUKUS is a big program. We can't afford to be putting off potentially other programs or maintenance and sustainment just to fund AUKUS. So there is a pressure point there that I think will become increasingly heavier over time. So I think there's a real debate to be had about the level of defence spending. There may be no magic level, but the reality is we do have to think about, particularly in a context where we're encouraging the US to do more in the Indo-Pacific, what are the specific capabilities and others that we can develop together that meet those objectives. On the first question, I think it's true to say that these are normally the discussions that are had in private. To some extent, they spilled over into the public arena because I think with the new administration that's been airing its concerns, I think the policy people at the Pentagon in particular have been trying to work through, as I alluded to earlier, their operational plans. And they're thinking, well, okay, as it was explained to me by someone at the White House, in the American case, if we have we have to have 3 boats to have 1 available in theatre, right? That's the sort of equation that they work on. But if we can have boats from Japan or Australia in the region available, it becomes a 1-to-1 thing. It takes some of the pressure off them as well. So from their perspective, they want some certainty that if they're planning particular operations or they're thinking about their planning, how do they count the Australians or others in? In the normal case, what we've said is once ownership, in this case of submarines, is transferred to Australia, they come under Australian command, and then the decisions about how they'll be deployed will be taken by the government of the day. Now, we have behind the scenes discussions with allies and partners about what that means in practice. And if we're talking about a Taiwan scenario, I think, frankly, cutting to the chase, the reality would be that things would happen very quickly in terms of the destabilization of the region if there were, say, the scenario was an outright invasion of the island of Taiwan. Decisions would have to be taken very quickly, and in those circumstances, Australia would have to weigh up the potential damage to the region from such a takeover or invasion, and particularly the impact it might have on allies and partners in the region close by, like Japan, for example, the Philippines, etc. So there's a lot of complexity to weigh up, but in the end, Australian planners think about this all the time, but as I alluded to at the beginning, would prefer to think and talk about this behind the scenes rather than in public, particularly in a context where the policy on Taiwan of the US has always been, at least historically, strategic ambiguity, to leave the Chinese guessing as to what the Americans would do. Under President Biden, not so much the administration, but himself, he was more strident about the fact that he would intervene if Taiwan were invaded. But normally, it's been a policy strategic ambiguity. And this administration seems to have been veering in the same direction as President Biden, but they haven't quite articulated it in the same way.
So that it's interesting you bring that up because, of course, the president of a different country, the Philippines, recently sort of got in hot water with Beijing over some questions that he was answering while he was in India. He was on a television show and was asked specifically about a Taiwan scenario and just said, frankly, I don't see how the Philippines would be able to stay out of it. And he just gave all these, it would be because of geography, because of refugee flows, because of all the Filipinos who live in Taiwan. And Beijing reacted very loudly to that. And actually, there's been quite a bit of other activity between Manila and Beijing. So how is it when countries that are not a superpower weigh in and talk about a Taiwan scenario? How does Beijing's potential reaction to anything you say out loud weigh into what you say out loud?
Well, I think in Australia's case, what's happened in recent years is under the Albanese government, the relationship with China was stabilised. They took off some of the economic and trade coercion we'd been subject to. So since then, I think there's been a view that while standing up for our national interest in relation to China, we don't necessarily spend a lot of time using stridently anti-Chinese language, which was a criticism that was made of the previous government, that maybe some of the language on China was particularly strident. I think the Americans have picked up on that. But I think they'd be mistaken if they think that this somehow means that Australia is not clear-eyed about China. We want to have a strong economic and trade relationship with China, but we also realise under Xi Jinping that they've had sharp elbows and that they've asserted themselves in ways which are not necessarily supportive of the way the global rules-based order has evolved. And there's a real question about the extent to which both Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin want to upend that global order. And of course, the challenge we face at the moment in the West is the extent to which the US, Western Europe, like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific like Australia, Japan, Korea, and others, what do we do in relation to that? How do we stand together, or is there a new global order that is evolving which is different to the one that's maintained peace and prosperity since World War II?
So in that sort of vein, there's an announcement, I guess, today that Australia, Philippines, and Canada had naval exercises in South China Sea. And there have been other of these sort of unilateral exercises and agreements involving Australia, but not with the U.S. So is this a recognition or a concern that the U.S. is pulling away and countries need to do more together?
Look, not necessarily, but in a world where people are sort of seeing the US potentially retrenching from some of its earlier commitments, not appearing to want to be the world's policeman, not as much the guarantor of the global order that we talked about before, countries will also seek to create optionality for themselves. And some of that optionality is precisely what you mentioned before, Jim, which is countries looking to do more together, not necessarily with the US. But none of what we're doing with Philippines and others is inconsistent with our alliance, in Australia's case in particular, our alliance with the US. But the reality is that countries will look at optionality. We're seeing this in the trade space where the tariff issues with the US are leading countries to do more to open up trade with other countries. In Australia's case, we've reopened the negotiations on the EU free trade agreement. So this issue of optionality is featuring, or hedging, if you like, is featuring in this sort of post-Cold War, post-unipolar moment sort of world that we're in.
So one of the themes of this particular episode has been getting the inside story from the guy who was there, right? So we're interested in going back a little in time to when you first got to Washington, D.C., and almost immediately after you arrived, we enter into this period of response to COVID. This is February of 2020. That had to have been, I mean, I know that I was in Australia at the time at the embassy there. It was a bizarre time for us. What was it like trying to manage the Australian mission to the United States in this time?
Well, I was lucky because I had at the embassy a deputy head of mission, Katrina Cooper, who'd been ambassador in Mexico, and she'd been through an earlier version, not of COVID, but of a related sort of pandemic a few years before. And she was very much on top of the processes for that. And she was a wonderful guide, I think, early on in what we needed to do. When I was going to ambassador school, before I turned up in Washington, it had been dinned into me the importance of occupational health and safety. And so the first reaction from me and from Katrina and others was, well, okay, how do we protect the staff in this situation? And my view was always, we will close down the embassy except for essential purposes. We will try and make work from home work. I led by example in that context because where possible, I would also work from home. Now, I have the advantage of the residence that, as Jim knows, or maybe you've been to as well, Ray, doesn't have a bad home office to work from. So I'm not complaining about that. But it was jarring as an ambassador where your job is to go out and meet people. I had to do most of it initially online, and that was a challenge. So that first year was tough because it was also an election year. It crimped or changed the way we had to do not just meetings, but also our election reporting because we could do less from the road. And it was, in that sense, it was a tough year. And seeing the pictures coming out of New York with all the coffins lined up in the street and all this sort of stuff, it was hard getting, I think, DFAT in Canberra sometimes to understand the extent to which COVID had impacted the US, because Canberra was fortunately in a bit of a bubble in that context. Whereas we were really felt quite exposed. And that first year, one of my dilemmas had been I'd just come off being ill. I'd had cancer treatment. My immunity had recovered. But one of the questions in my mind when COVID first hit was, well, what do I do? Do I stay at my post or I go back to Australia? I decided to stay at my post because that was my job. And also when you're a leader, you have to lead by example. So I stayed. I was very lucky I didn't get COVID till the second year. But that first year was a combination of COVID, elections, Black Lives Matter protests. Everything was happening. I remember President Trump coming back from hospital after he'd had COVID, and he was standing on the White House balcony, and the apocryphal story is that he had said to his staff, I want to wear a Superman costume underneath so I can open up my shirt and show, see, Superman, I beat COVID. I mean, such a showman. But yeah, that was a very interesting introduction to Washington that first year. Things settled down in the second year, and here I give credit to the administration financing Operation Warp Speed to get those mRNA vaccines out as quickly as possible. Fantastic, not just for the US, but the world. And that just showed what I think is one of the great things about the US is the capacity when something has to be done, the way the big ship just turns around and boom, gets on with it. And you guys, the administration, the American government did a great job of doing that, not just for the US, but for the world.
So the other piece of history you were involved with then was January 6th during the transition. How do you report that back to Canberra as ambassador to the US? It must have been so confusing. And how do you reassure Australia the US will get through this?
The first thing was to make sure that the reporting back home was, if you like, flat and factual, rather than, woe is me or slit the wrist. We're professionals. We're dealing with an overseas situation that we are being paid to analyse clearly and dispassionately, which we did. I have to say the first concern that day was just about the staff around Washington to make sure that people were okay and were not exposed unduly. And I remember, about a fortnight afterwards going to the inauguration of President Biden, which was outside, freezing cold. And I remember, seeing the rows of National Guardsmen, the wires and everything else. And what it reminded me was the way this would have played around the world, including Australia, which was, how could this possibly happen in the US? And how could this possibly happen in Washington? But it was a reminder, again, of how polarized the politics had become. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the situation, the reality is that the country was very politicized, very polarized, and remains polarized. And people in Australia who slash their wrists and say, oh, what's happened in America? Why has America gone down this particular route? I think they fail to understand there are rational reasons why people vote the way they vote. It's not just because they've suddenly gone mad, in inverted commas. And we have to understand why there were so many Americans who either felt marginalized, disenfranchised, disempowered, and who felt angry about the direction of the country, exacerbated by economic issues, immigration issues, and others. But, there's an indicator here in the US, which is the country going in the right or wrong direction. And for the last 20 or so years, that indicator's been going in the wrong direction, pointing in the wrong direction. And that's why you've had a number of changes of administration along the way. It'll be interesting to see how the next 3 or 4 years go. There's a lot of discussion here in the US, of course, as you know, about the durability, the resilience of institutions. I've said before that I think the president is working on the basis that having won both houses in the Congress and with the Supreme Court being largely supportive and all the rest of it, getting a popular mandate as well as the Electoral College, that he feels for the moment that he has the public support to exercise the democratic equivalent of unfettered power and dare the Congress and the courts and others to pull him back. And he's come to power this time, I think, determined to leave his mark, more organised, better prepared than he was the first time, and has people around him who are totally, I think, dedicated to that mission.
So we're coming up on time, so I want to give you a chance for an exit question, and I'm going to try this one. You know, as an ambassador, you obviously had to deal with delegations coming from Australia to talk about all manner of things with the American government. What are some of the biggest misconceptions that you found that Aussies would have about the U.S. that you tried to correct as they came in, or just tried to remind them that these are some ways that the U.S. may not be what you think it is?
Well, this is exactly the point. And it was my experience as well, because I'd visited America any number of times, but I'd not actually lived here. And it's different when you live here. But also, you're right, when delegations came in, I think there was just an expectation that we speak the same language, we have similar laws, common interests, common values in many ways. Things should be, in that sense, relatively straightforward. But I think people underestimate the impact of history in this country compared to a country like Australia. I mean, history here, the Constitution looms much larger in the American consciousness than it does, our Constitution does in Australia. I think the history, slavery, the Civil War, you go through all of that. All of that weighs heavily on America. The constitutional provisions, like whether it's the free speech, Article 1, or Article 2, the right to bear arms, you can see how they play out in very contemporary circumstances. And they play out in ways that Australians probably find hard to understand until they come here and see the context and the history. So part of it is making Australians understand that we have a lot in common, we get on very well, we've got each other's back in many ways, but these are very different countries, very different approaches to the social safety net, very different approaches to risk, One of the things that attracts me to this country, frankly, one of the things as ambassador I was very interested in, having been an industry minister, was the way industry develops, how innovation develops, how commercialization occurs, and why it works so well in the US. And so, yeah, I think Australians have got to understand that, people here paint on a very broad canvas and in very bright colors.
All right. Well, that was a very colorful interview. We really thank you for joining us. Arthur Sinodinos, former Australian ambassador to the U.S. You've been very generous with your time, and we're really happy to have had you. We hope we can have you again.
No, great fun. Always good to be, particularly with you, Jim. A great colleague and did a fantastic job as the Charge in Canberra for such an extended period.
Thank you, Arthur. Always happy to hear that every time.
He pays me well for that.
And with a very skilled and attractive defense attaché, I might add.
Oh, always. Goes without saying.
And of course, we want to thank our generous sponsor, Bauer Group Asia, a strategic advisory firm that specializes in the Indo-Pacific. Bauer Group applies unmatched expertise and experience to help clients navigate the world's most complex and dynamic markets. Jim Caruso, my co-host, is a senior advisor with Bauer Group. And of course, we want you to go and visit their website at bauergroupasia.com. Well, Jim, I love that interview because we got to get into what it was really like honestly, this is kind of why we got into this to a large extent, is to try to help people understand what things look like. What does actual spacecraft, how does it happen? How is the sausage made?
It also shows how fast things can happen.
Yeah.
You and I were involved in these Osmonds where there are ministers of
Australia U.S. ministerial Osmond. Yep.
And we're involved, at least 3 of them, maybe with you, it's 4 between the 2 of us. And nuclear subs were never discussed. We discussed everything. And if someone had asked me, will Australia ever want these? It was no, because Australians are allergic to anything with the word nuclear in it.
True.
So there you go.
There you go.
Good thing I wasn't there. You were supposed to be advising them.
Exactly. Well, I think the whole thing about secrecy, it really does show you that, first of all, the people who are going to be unhappy about this, China, France, many of the ASEAN states, they were going to be unhappy regardless. So the question is, how early in the process do you make them unhappy, right? They, of course, many of these places, France, China, they would have wanted to be unhappy early so they could talk us out of it. And so there are good reasons not to bring them in early. But of course, the later they find out, the more unhappy they are.
Well, I also like what Arthur said, that basically Biden said, you Australians have to hose down the French. I'll leave it to you. And then that didn't work, so we sent Blinken.
Exactly. All right. So you and Arthur Sinodinos go back a little ways.
Well, I met him early on in my second tenure in Australia because I had instructions to try and get Australia to finance a space department equivalent to our NASA.
Yeah.
Because we thought it's a good place for launching certain satellites, because we thought it'd be useful for a more professional relationship in space. And Australia had always said no as a budget issue. So Arthur, as the Minister for Industry and Science, was my key point. And as you know, when you go into these meetings with someone you haven't met, you try and find something to talk about first.
Sure.
Right? Because you want to have a little personal bond. So that's when I went in, and I knew he was Greek. So I started off with the Greek connection. And God love us. It turns out his parents and my grandfather were from the same little island. And so I take that as the reason that he eventually said yes.
Well, okay. Well, since he started out this entire conversation with a bunch of discussion about Greece that, frankly, I couldn't keep up with, and was sitting here thinking, what is happening, right? And, what is he actually saying? So I guess that helps me understand and put that back in context. So I appreciate that little insight.
The Greek mafia is strong.
And now I understand something about why you keep telling me Greek stories. in an Indo-Pacific podcast. Thank you very much.
I cannot help it.
All right. Well, it's all Greek to Ian Ellis Jones, our producer. We want to thank him, of course, as always. We want to encourage you to go and look at his military and geopolitical graphics over on his X channel at Ian Ellis Jones. And by the way, to those who have been clamoring to hear from Ian, we have heard you. We promise there is something coming. It may have something to do with our 100th episode. That's a little teaser. So, and by the way, we did put a couple of internet polls out there and asked what we should do for our 100th episode. And Let Ian Talk has been coming across loud and clear. So Ian is shy, but we're going to drag him out and show him to the world so that you can see him actually on the screen for once. We may actually even make him take his hat off, which we can see and you can't. So meanwhile, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and follow. If you're watching on YouTube, so it's been made clear to me just by listening to enough of these things that the subscribe thing on YouTube involves a bell. So you're supposed to ring the bell to subscribe to our channel. And you definitely want to do that because it makes us happy. And making us happy is, of course, the most important thing in your life. It also helps us get the word out to a lot of other people about our podcast. And it suggests videos to you into your timeline if we're putting them out. And there have been a lot of really interesting and exciting things going on that we've been able to cover. You noticed that we talked about a bunch of other guests that we've had on the podcast on this topic, and several of them came up. We talked to Malcolm Turnbull last year, former Prime Minister, episode 28. We talked to Congressman Courtney, episode 60. We talked to Ambassador Hockey, the predecessor to Ambassador Sinodinos, in episode 74. So there are lots of places you can go back to learn more about this topic and hear from, different perspectives on how this whole AUKUS thing happened. Finally, we want to remind you, go ahead and email us if you're interested in what we're going to do in episode 100. If you're interested in suggesting guests, we do get a lot of those. We do read all of those. We don't read the ones that come from solicitors as much because we're not really interested in your services. Thank you very much. We are very much interested in the people who actually listen to the podcast. So if you're one of those people, please feel free to write to us at Indo-Pacificpodcast@gmail.com. That's Indo-Pacificpodcast@gmail.com. And finally, we want to remind you to go and visit our sponsor at powergroupasia.com. This has been fun. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Ian. And we hope that you'll join us again next time on Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?